You're known to have a propensity for doing Beckett's plays. It's an absurdist sort of line of theater that has never been so well received in Canada. Can you tell me why? What has interested you in the more, shall we say, risky plays?
Well, nothing very profound. I think I can say honestly that it got started because it was a job, and I was looking for a job. The first of the Beckett plays I did was the one with which I'm most closely associated, I suppose, which was Krapp's Last Tape. And that happened in, I opened in it in January of 1960. That was just after I had gone to New York in September of '59 for a year's sabbatical from the Crest Theatre. And although I went to New York on purpose because I was trying to prove a point to myself. The sort of pressures of producing the Crest Theatre with my brother Murray were such that I hadn't had the opportunity to act for about 2.5 years. And I came to the conclusion that if I was going to continue to act, I'd better get back to it. Or if not, then I'd better concentrate on being a producer. And I went to New York because I thought it was the toughest actors market around, and I'd like to measure myself against it. So I went to New York, not as a rank amateur or a student just out of school, but in my early 30s as someone who had done pretty well everything that was available to do in Canada, including Stratford, and got down there and found out September and October, November, December, I really couldn't get myself arrested. I couldn't get a job of any kind, although I was not without contacts in New York, and I had a very fancy agent and so on. And I happened to be in touch with the director, Alan Schneider. And Alan Schneider was, until his death, as it were, Beckett's director of choice in North America. He, in fact, did, I think, all of Beckett's plays were directed by Schneider for the first time they were done in New York. And Alan was committed to do Krapp's Last Tape for the producer Richard Barr under the production name of the theatre 1960. Barr was interested in doing new plays, experimental plays, off-Broadway. And Krapp's Last Tape was to be part of a double bill with a play called The Zoo Story by Edward Obie, which was to be the first professional production of an Obie play. And when I first heard about this, the actor Eli Wallach was supposed to play Krapp's Last Tape, which, in case we all don't know it, is a solo, single-handed performance of an elderly gentleman who keeps a diary on his birthday annually, and he records his thoughts of the past year and the current year to come on a tape recorder. And anyway, for reasons, I've never asked Eli Wallach this, I should do it sometime. For reasons best known to Eli, he withdrew from this rather late in the day, and everything else was ready to go. The Obie play was cast and ready to go, and Alan Schneider had set aside the appropriate time to rehearse it, and he was ready to go. So they were looking for an actor. Now, some years before, in 19 '56, the autumn of '56, I believe it was, I got a call from CBS in New York saying that a director who I never heard of, called Alan Schneider, wanted me to do Tiresias in the Oedipus Rex. And I was astonished. That had never happened to me before. And I said, "You mean to audition for it?" They said, no. He wants you to do it. And long story short, the necessary arrangements were made, and I went off to New York to do it. I was introduced to Mr. Schneider, whom I'd never met. And it turned out he had been in Edinburgh the previous summer, where we had taken the Guthrie production of Oedipus from Stratford to the Edinburgh Festival. And of course that production was done in wonderful masks by Tanya Milzevich. And I had played Tiresias, the 900-year-old prophet. But of course I had been totally covered with a mask, and Alan was mildly astonished to see this person who was in fact 28 and not looking really 900 years old at all. Anyway, he went with it, and I did the part with wearing a lot of latex makeup. So Alan knew that I could play aged parts, that's the point. And that's how I got to play Krapp in Krapp's Last Team. And Alan and I became close friends. And therefore, when he was embarked on doing a new Beckett project, he, I'm happy to say, frequently thought of me. And so I got to do several programs, Beckett plays, but always with Alan Schneider. That's how that all happened. And I must say, I find the material absolutely fascinating. It's a huge challenge, but people attribute to me a personal and particular knowledge of Beckett or some such, and I really am not qualified. I have never studied Beckett in any intellectual or academic sense. I just have had the opportunity of doing his plays with, I think, somebody, i.e. Alan Schneider, who had a real sort of comprehension and sensitivity to Beckett's work.
You were often cast as an older person, though. You did tell a Globe and Mail journalist that about 13 years ago.
Yes. Yeah, well, as you notice, I have a deep voice, and even when I was a youngster doing amateur plays in various venues, although I might be younger than the rest of the people in the play, I usually had by far and away the deeper voice, or deepest voice. And traditionally, if you're casting plays with extremely young people, and you require a father or a grandfather or some such, usually the male with the deepest voice gets cast in the older roles, and that happened to me. And I've been traditionally playing characters considerably older than myself all my professional life. I'm now, of course, growing into those parts, but
even your amateur life, it looks like you did that in school quite a bit too.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little more about other players who might have had this kind of be typically cast in roles such as Tyrone Guthrie did act, in fact. He was a bit tall, and that's one of the reasons he didn't act after all. Who else had that kind of physical limitation or a physical advantage? Perhaps corpulence, that kind of thing, ladies of certain looks. Who comes to mind?
not sure that I can answer that. I will hasten to say that I've never really considered it a disadvantage. Deep voicedness, if there is such an expression, lends itself to playing older parts and frequently to villains, and I've done my fair share of both. But cantankerous old grandfathers and sinister villains tend to be much more interesting work than the bland and beautiful hero who, provide far less interesting situations to portray than the villains and the older character parts.
Could it be that you got some authoritative voice by being a producer for years and running a theatre?
Oh no, the voice, such as it is, was present long before I became a producer.
Would you please tell me the events leading up to yours and your brother's founding of the Crest Theatre? And could you give me some dates?
Well, we had dabbled in theatre all of our lives. Our mother died when we were very young, and our spiritual and cultural upbringing fell to an aunt, Mrs. Aubrey Davis, Aunt Et, as she was known. And so we were exposed as youngsters to piano lessons, singing lessons, drama lessons, etc., etc. And one of the people we worked with was a lady called Josephine Barrington, who was from Toronto. And she had a class of young people, which she ultimately called Josephine Barrington's Juveniles. And she conducted classes with them, teaching them how to breathe, how to speak, how to, all those things. And usually once a year, usually at Christmas time, she would put on a play at Hart House Theatre. Well, my aunt caught on to this lady, and we had a summer home in Muskoka. My aunt contracted with Josephine to come up for 2 weeks every summer, which she did for some years, from about 1932, 33 to 1940. Well, 6-7 years she did this. And we used to put on a play. We would work with Josephine during the day, and at the end of 2 weeks, we would put on a performance of this play, which was usually a Shakespearean play, much cut and Bowdlerized, needless to say, but we, being my 3 siblings, I have 2 sisters and a brother, and 3 female cousins and a couple of waifs and strays, so there were about 9 or 10 of us children up there. And we just did this as a matter of course. It was some years later that I realized that not everybody settled down to do a Shakespeare play in the summer, but it just seemed to be the thing to do. Of course, from the aunt's point of view, it was to keep the children occupied, as in the devil find work for idle hands to do, I think was very much in her thinking. And we picked up a little cultural by the wayside. So that was the origin of one's interest in the theatre. When one moved on into high school and then university, one seemed to naturally, or I certainly naturally, it seemed quite obvious that I would involve myself in school dramatics. I had the advantage of knowing a little bit more about it than my fellow students. And while at university, I went to university in autumn of 46. My brother, Murray, had by that time spent 3 years or so in the Navy and was discharged, so that instead of having 4 years between us, which under ordinary circumstances would have meant that he probably would have been graduating from university just as I was starting out, that gap got sort of squeezed down, and we ended up being a year apart because he'd been away during the war. So we were at university at the same time. That coincided with the arrival in Toronto at the university of Robert Gill, who was hired to become the professional director of Hart House Theatre. Now, up until the end of the war, Hart House had been a community theatre which the Masseys had instituted. Although it was located in the basement of Hart House, it was not a university function the way Hart House was until the end of World War II, when the Massey Foundation formally turned the theatre over to the university, and the university in its turn hired Robert Gill as a director, professional from Carnegie Tech. And Murray and I turned out for the auditions that Bob established, and we both got involved in it from that first year on. And at the end of that first year, which would have been in the summer of '47, Robert Gill returned to Woodstock, New York, now, of course, fabled for the great rock concert, but to the Woodstock Playhouse, which still exists, and he was the resident director. In those days, these theaters tended to have a permanent company with guest directors, or a permanent director and guest stars, that sort of thing. Bob was the permanent director, and he invited a bunch of us from Toronto to come to Woodstock as apprentices. It was within his purview to appoint the apprentices. And we considered ourselves lucky because in those days, not only did an apprentice not get paid, but in many instances, the apprentice had to pay the company for the privilege of being an apprentice. Well, we didn't have to do that, but we were not paid. And we spent a highly sort of exciting summer mixing with professional actors and working with people who, to us, were very glamorous, like Alyssa Landy and Ruth Ford and Clarence Derwent, Edith King. These were all well-known Broadway names. And we started talking about what we would do the following summer. We being specifically my brother Murray and the actress Charmian King, who was one of our number. And at that point in time, this is '47, you couldn't come to the United States to work if you were a Canadian. You were not allowed to do that. In other words, you couldn't just write for a job and get a job in the States. And that summer of '47, there was no local, in Canada, no Toronto-based summer stock company. So what were we going to do the following summer? Well, we decided that if there wasn't any stock company, we'd better start one. So we decided we would start a summer stock company, which turned out to be the Straw Hat Players, which based itself in Muskoka, because that was the area we knew from our childhood summers. And we were based out of Gravenhurst and played both Gravenhurst and Port Carling. And that first summer, we even played Huntsville one night a week. And that's how we got into producing. My brother and I produced it. Charmian was a founding member, although she never really participated in the actual administration of the company.
And from there to the Crest.
Well, to our astonishment, that first summer in Gravenhurst achieved quite remarkable little success. I mean, we became quite successful, and amongst other things, we produced, this was Bob Gill's idea, a sort of cabaret version of an old 19th century melodrama called The Drunkard, or The Fallen Saved, by the Reverend Mr. Smith. And this literally was a melodrama, and of course the basis of its, the plot basis was the evils of demon rum, and our heroes fall into the disgrace and deterioration of drinking, and his final redemption, and so on. Well, we took this old melodrama and it was cut to pieces, I mean, just barest of plot lines throughout, but every scene was interspersed with vaudeville sketches. And there was a company at that time which had done this for years with that play, The Drunkard, in San Francisco, and it was a great tourist attraction. And you went and you hissed the villain and cheered the hero and heroine, and in between you had these period songs and sketches and so on, which we did. And it was so popular that my brother and I, in conjunction with Brian Doherty, who was a lawyer by trade, but a theater maven, and had written at least one play which was performed on Broadway called Father Maliki's Miracle. And Brian had also been responsible for bringing to Toronto tours of John Gielgud in The Importance of Being Earnest, and the Dublin Gate Theatre Company, and so on and so forth. Brian, whom we'd known since we were children, and Mary and I got together and we co-produced a production of The Drunkard, which I didn't tour with it because I was still at university, but Murray had graduated that summer, and he headed a company which toured right across Canada to Victoria and back, and even down into the States to Detroit and Chicago and a couple of other places, that following winter. Then the following summer we did our second season in Gravenor and Port Carling. And that autumn we put together a review, a cavalcade from 1900 to 1950 called There Goes Yesterday. And that we also toured. By the end of the second tour, everybody was bankrupt, of course, but also exhausted, because it was an exhausting business, just moving across the country. And we realized that while we'd solved quite successfully what to do with the 10 summer weeks of the year, what happened to the other 42, you see? Well, we had come to the conclusion that that kind of touring wasn't really the answer. And so we decided the thing to do was to establish a year-round company in Toronto and try and establish it and establish a reputation, then think about touring at a later date. So we stopped the touring aspect of our lives and started concentrating on developing a permanent company in Toronto, which ultimately happened in 1953, and we opened that theatre, which was, of course, the Crest Theatre, in January of 1954.
Can you tell me about how did you discover a certain theatre in Mount Pleasant that looked to rent? Tell me the story with Lorne Green as well. Didn't he also try to get the theatres?
That particular theatre? I suppose that's possible. I don't have any recollection of that. My brother, Murray and I, in the autumn and winter of 52, 53, we were both in England working there. And my brother left to come back to Toronto in about February of '53 to start looking for a place to establish this theatre. Now there were, well, I was going to say a lot. I don't know that there were a lot of them, but there were a few at least theatre buildings like the Crest, which had started out in life being the Belsize Theatre at Belsize in Mount Pleasant. And they were theatres that were built in the 20s when movies were still frequently an adjunct of vaudeville. I mean, they would show one film and then put on a program of vaudeville as well. So that theatre was built with a quite modest stage and 2 or 3 dressing rooms and so on, so that it had the capability of doing some vaudeville. But of course, they rapidly became nothing but film houses. And the Crest, which had, as I say, been the Belsize, and at some point famous players had decided to renovate it and gussy it up, and they also decided, for reasons best known to them, to change its name to the Crest Theatre. And it was just one that had that sort of capability. And at that time, moment in time when Murray was looking for space, that one was available, and we glommed onto it. Now, it's possible, I suppose you're talking about the advent of the Jupiter Theatre. Is that when you use Lorne Green? I can't think of any other reason that Lorne would be in the market for a theatre. He was running the Lorne Green Academy, which was a training school for radio artists. And he was involved in the founding of along with John Draney and several others, the founding of the Jupiter Theatre. And he could have been, they could have been looking at the same space. I just don't remember that as being, I came back that summer in midsummer, just in time for the opening of the original Stratford season in July of '53. And by that time, we had already secured the Crest. So I really wasn't around for that search. And
Ned Taylor. Green failed to make a deal with Ned Taylor on the Crest. That's the info I've got.
well, Nat Taylor was there was a secondary firm. Was it 20th Century Theatres or something of the kind? They were in fact controlled. The owner was in fact Famous Players, but the lessee was Nat Taylor and 20th Century, and they were all corporately involved with each other. I can't remember, but Nat Taylor was the man with whom we actually signed the lease.
We were talking about Beckett before. Another Beckett, actually, was a role you did. Thomas Beckett in Murder in the Cathedral by T.S. Eliot, Jack Skinner in Robertson Davies, A Jig for the Gypsy, Malvolio. So you were running the theatre and acting there at the same time, where you could tell me a bit about your dual duties and what a typical day might have been like for you with all of the drudgery in administration as well as acting.
Well, what we attempted to do, not always successfully, my brother and I, our original interest in running a theatre was an opportunity to act. We both wanted to be actors. When we finally got the Crest underway, it, of course, was far more complex operation than running the summer stock company.
We're just finishing up talking about the British way.
Yes.
You were going to mention something about Barry Moore.
Well, as with Douglas Campbell, so with Barry Morris. Barry was, for some years there, was one of the most prominent of leading actors with the CBC here in Toronto, working for Andrew, for Essa Young, so on. We also worked with him because he was the director of choice of Bill Friedman, who was a friend and colleague of ours as well. Bill was on the Crest Board of Governors for several years, and was also married to our old friend and colleague Toby Robbins. And but Barry's contribution far exceeded just snagging all the best roles in the CBC drama. I mean, he did an enormous amount of work directing and helping to develop plays and so on and so forth, and his involvement with the ill-fated Jupiter Company. I think Barry was involved in that. Also, one should mention the advent of the directors at CBC. I'm thinking, in particular, of Charles Jarrett, who was, of course, married to Catherine Blake, and Kate worked with us, notably in the summer of the 17th Doll, also in the production of Clara Booth's Luce's The Women, and David, television director David, God, my mind's gone. Never mind.
I probably have it here somewhere.
I'm sure you do.
You were mentioning that when the British came over, some people in Britain, they said they had very set, defined roles, they took orders, but here in Canada they were able to try new things.
I'm not sure what you mean. That's somebody else's conceit, obviously.
It's just that Douglas Campbell, you said he contributed a great deal to Canadian theatre at large, and one of the things he said was he was leaving a confined role for the freedom of the Canadian scene.
Well, that I think is true, and one of the and one was aware of it at the time. Even if you were dealing, say, with an old chestnut of a play, I'm thinking, for example, of Charlie's Aunt, which is a play we did at the Crest. Everything we did in those days was brand new because it was breaking new ground. And, during the late 40s and 50s, an enormous number of people who were coming to our shows were probably seeing theatre for the first time in their lives, so that it all had the excitement of breaking new ground, and it was very exciting. It was enormously exciting.
The professional standards at the Crest, by the way, to get back to that, were always the highest in Toronto by far. Now, that's a quote. Is that true?
Well, I'm wondering whose euphoric comment that was. We certainly felt they were pretty damn high. I know that the production values on the physical level, I mean set design and costume design and property design and all that kind of thing, I think we're definitely the highest, or certainly as high as it got in Toronto. I think the talent quotient was really very high. I'm thinking of a production of The Three Sisters, which we did in the mid-50s, which we imported an American director called Jack Landau to come up from New York to direct it. But it had a cast which included Amelia Hall, Charmian King, Kate Reed. They were the Three Sisters themselves. I was played in it. I played, I can't even remember my name. But it also included Norman Welsh, Tony Van Bridge, Richard Easton, Edwin Stevenson, Alan Nunn. It was an extraordinary concentration of talent. And that was not an unusual mix at the Crest. We had access to some of the very best talent that Canada has produced. And has gone on to prove themselves in that area. Where we got the most criticism, and I think probably deservedly so, was that there was a wildly varying degree of excellence in the plays that we did, the actual material itself. And I've already covered this earlier in our conversation, but it was this compulsion to try and be excellent and do excellent work at the same time trying to make it commercially viable at the same time, which was, it was a dichotomy which could never be successfully, achieved.
You were less activist than, say, the New Play Society and the Jupiter.
Well, what do you mean by activist?
Was your focus more on entertainment and as you were pointing, the mix of the highbrow and popularity, whereas the New Play Society and the Jupiter I've had heard termed as activist, possibly more political?
Well, I don't know that I would. I guess there was a faintly political aspect to the Jupiter Theatre. I don't know. I don't think Dora Mavor Moore had a political agenda, unless Mavor was trying to sneak something in on the side. But no, I don't think so. I mean, but they were consistently doing. They didn't lapse into pot boilers the way we did, but then we were trying to do 20 productions a year, and they were not doing that. They were not continuously producing. I mean, they would do a play, and then there would be a dark period, and then they'd do their second play. You know what I mean? It was a. And I also think I'm right. We were attempting to pay our performers a living wage. In other words, so that if they did nothing else except work for the Crest for a season, they could afford to, meet their expenses. They could afford to pay the rent and buy the food and send their children properly clothed to school. And that's, we hoped we were doing that and prided ourselves that we were. Whereas frequently the other theatre companies that were certainly functioning at that time, the work was interrupted. It wasn't a week in, week out basis. And frequently the remuneration was more in the area of an honorarium than a living salary.
In 1957, losses were approximately $100,000. Finances were always a headache, were they?
Yes, always.
Yeah. Can you tell me how you managed to hold it together? Did you ever come near bankruptcy before, during, and after that?
Well, we sort of lurched from crisis to crisis. That coincides, that figure you mentioned coincides with the year that, first of all, we split the company in two and took a company to London with the glass cage while continuing to run the theatre here in Toronto. It also reflects the year that as hopefully as an assistance to our operation of the theatre, we converted it from a private production company to a non-profit foundation. The early years had been, the producing company had been called Murray and Donald Davis Limited, and we had sold shares in that in order to finance the company. Needless to say, we never produced anything like a dividend for it. But when we started the Crest in 54, there was no funding for theatre, available. There was no Canada Council, there was no Arts Council of Ontario, there was no funding from the City of Toronto. There was no funding. So you had to find capital as best you could, and we opted to go that route because even if it was unrealistic in terms of a business proposition, in other words, even if the chances of us ever producing a dividend were negligible to the extreme, at least it was a form of business development that was comprehensible to your average businessman and hopefully encouraged him to believe that we were A, responsible, and B, meant business, and knew what we were doing. But no, we did, after much difficulty, we did succeed in getting non-profit foundation status for the company, whereupon the producing unit became known as the Crest Theatre Foundation. And then we were eligible to apply to the Canada Council, and as they came on stream, various other funding bodies, leading one into the sort of curious moral dilemma. The Canada Council at that time, and probably still does, amongst its criteria for awarding grants to producing companies, they wanted to know from one year to another, they needed you to show by virtue of your financial statements and your end of the year accounting, they wanted to see a progress. They wanted to see that your ability to raise money from the private sector was increasing, that your ticket sales were increasing. And in order to justify their giving you a grant. The City of Toronto, on the other hand, were asking you with the same set of books, of course. Their attitude was, well, if you don't desperately need us to stay alive, then we aren't going to give you anything. So you were encouraged to take one set of books and take them to Ottawa and prove that you were getting better every day in every way, and take them down to City Hall in Toronto and show that unless you had immediate assistance, you were going to go under, which leads to a sort of schizophrenic attitude. And I somehow think that, artistic operations like that shouldn't be placed in that very ambivalent position. I think it's short-sighted on somebody's part. You only have one set of books. Well, at least we only had one set of books. Maybe other people did feature two sets of books. But
how much did the poor reviews play into the downfall with the attendance troubles and all that? Did it really?
Yes, I get asked that a lot, or used to get asked that a lot. Usually the question is phrased, did Nathan Cohen close your theatre? And the answer is no. Let's just get rid of that. Nathan hounded us unmercifully. He really did. But Nathan didn't close the theatre. I don't know of any critic that can be said to have closed the theatre. Certainly, had Nathan viewed us with a less jaundiced eye, I'm sure our ticket sales would have reflected it. I mean, I'm sure we would have sold more tickets. But he didn't. Of course, what everyone forgets, we were invaluable to Nathan. But we were, because he had, we were the only game in town. We provided him, I mean, the Royal Alexander was bringing in and out in those days, you know, sometimes they were black for weeks at a time, and there'd be, you know, various and sundry touring productions coming through. But we were grist for Nathan's mill. I mean, every 2 weeks, he had a Crest production to criticize. And we could become what is the term I'm trying to think of, the well, the whipping boy, but we could serve him as the bad old sort of oh, my mind's gone blank. You know, the conservative, Nathan being somewhat left-wing, you know, the establishment, that's what I'm trying to think. We could be served as the establishment theatre in Toronto, which Nathan could rail against, and did. But we were vitally important to him because, you see, when I first knew of Nathan Cohen, I was an undergraduate at the University of Toronto. I was playing in Robert Gill's productions at Hart House Theatre. And suddenly, there appeared backstage at Hart House copies of a publication called the Canadian Jewish Weekly. Well, needless to say, not all of us who were at the University of Toronto, not all undergraduates, rushed out to acquire their copy of the Canadian Jewish Weekly every week. So they were provided conveniently for our perusal, with specific attention being drawn to the dramatic reviews of university productions, now amateur student productions we were doing, by somebody called Nathan Cohen. He was writing these reviews, and he wanted to be sure that he had an audience, and that the players whose work he was criticizing should be aware of what he was doing, because, as I say, in the normal course of events, you weren't likely to pick up the Canadian Jewish Weekly with your morning cup of coffee. So that's when I first met Nathan, and he worked very hard at establishing himself as a force to be reckoned with in drama criticism, and he worked very hard creating this persona. I mean, he ultimately acquired long flowing capes and canes with silver knobs and all this stuff. Nathan worked very hard developing a persona. It was a career for him. And we were very much a part of his career. I didn't appreciate being that for him, but that's what we were. And he was writing negative reviews about the Crest long after the theatre had been closed. I mean, there in this, I don't even looked at that, but there are several in there that post-date the Crest being closed. He couldn't let it alone. And he, particularly my poor brother Murray, he used to take out after Murray and write open letters to the Board of Governors explaining to them why they should fire Murray on the spot, and so on and so forth. But even with all that activity, I will maintain that Nathan didn't really, in any material sense, close the theatre. He was a fact of life, but...
Was it like better to talk about us than...
Oh, I think so, sure, yes. I mean, spell the name right, but...
I have something here. I'm not sure you can comment on this, but Douglas Campbell, Michael Langan, Barry Morris, Mavor Moore, Leon Major, who went on to start the Neptune Theatre in the Maritimes. I haven't really researched this yet. Can you tell me anything about the Neptune? What do you know, and did you lose any good people to that?
No. The answer to that is no. My memory Leon Major went to Halifax to be artistic director of the Neptune Theatre, and he was there some few years. But I don't think he started it. I mean, I think it existed before he got there. I don't remember Michael Langham ever going to the Neptune, although he might have guest directed, but he was never there for any length of time. He was from 1956 until 1968, I think. For 10 or 12 years, he was the artistic director of Stratford, which, believe me, is a full-time job. I mean, and I don't, as I say, he may have guest directed, although I don't recall that. But mind you, I was out of Canada from 59 to 72, so I don't know whether Mavor went down there. Mavor was appointed, Mavor for many years was the first appointment to every going job in Canada. He was the first head of CBC television. He was the first head of this, that, and the other. He was the first head of the, St. Lawrence Centre, the, what is now the, I want to say Bella Apsug, that's not what I mean, Bluma Appel Theatre. He was the first artistic director of it, which a position he held only for a brief period of time, and then sort of installed Leon. There was a collaboration between he and Leon, who then became the artistic director. But to link all those people up with the Neptune, certainly the Neptune never in any sense deprived us of people who were working there, or we wanted to work with. We gave Leon one of his first full-fledged, full-blown productions to direct at the Crest, and was happy to do so because it was one of our avowed intents, was to bring along native directors. But I don't recall. Mavor would know that in a trance.
I'll ask him. How about in Ottawa? Amelia Hall was working. Did you have a relationship between the Crest and Amelia's theatre?
Well, no. By the time the Crest opened, the Canadian Repertory Theatre was closing down. I worked for Millie in the very early 50s, 51 I think it was. I went and did 2 plays for her. She did a production of Hamlet, which was very daring of her, with Richard Easton, the young Richard Easton playing Hamlet, and I played Claudius. Older villain again. And then I did Andre Obey's Noah, which is again an old man, which part that John Gielgud had created in London some years before. And that was all very exciting, and Millie did an extraordinary job, and under very trying and touch and go circumstances. I mean, we all in those days, we were all playing, cat and mouse with the budget. I mean, there wasn't any money to do anything. Created regularly silk purses out of sows' ears all the time.
Who were the philanthropers of the industry? Lady Eaton was mentioned as one.
Well, Lady Eaton certainly had a lot to do with with supporting the Canadian players. In Ottawa, Millie's Theatre, the Canadian Repertory Theatre, a man called Charlie Southgate, Mr. Charles Southgate, was very much a patron of Millie's, and I think kept her going on more than one occasion. And I guess we had a group of people who were amongst our original shareholders, whom we turned to from time to time. Our one gentleman who was our longtime chairman of our board, Mr. George Harris, was certainly a benefactor. Mr. Clare Stewart, it's S-T-E-W-A-R-T, and C-L-A-I-R. And Mrs. John David Eaton, Signe Eaton. I mean, that doesn't mean that these were people who were supplying regular funds, but they are people who, from time to time, would come to our assistance if we were in trouble.
Would you know anything about the Alberta, particularly? I'm thinking Elizabeth Sterling Haynes and Bev Mitchell in Alberta. They were doing some theatre, as well as Ellen Burgess in Saskatchewan. Do you know?
I know the names, but I never had anything personally to do with them.
Mm-hmm. So Amelia Hall did perform at the Crest as well, didn't she?
Oh, indeed she did, yes, mm-hmm. many, many times. And with the Straw Hat Players as well. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And she worked with Mavor Moore, directed there as well, at the Crest, I believe.
Isn't that awful? I can't remember.
Did you know Leo Chichery?
Very well.
Could you please tell me about Leo Chichery, the late Leo Chichery?
Yes, Leo was a Montreal actor, protege of Herbert Whittaker's, along with John Colicos. You know Colicos? He was also, he's also a prominent Montreal actor. Eleanor Stewart, you come across that name? Well, Eleanor, and she taught both John and Leo, I believe. Leo was very talented, extremely handsome, sort of leading man type. He worked, as a lot of us did, he spent interludes both working in England and in New York, London and New York, at various times during his career. And he worked for us at the Crest, not while I was there, but my brother directed a production of, Henry V, and to that extent recommended that he get in touch with Gracien Gélinas, whom I did know. And that's in fact what happened. Now, I claim that idea originated with me. Langham, left to his own device, I've never challenged him on it, but left to his own devices will lead you to believe it was all his own idea. But,
so you were saying about Chichery. What was it he did again?
Well, he worked for the Crest. He did a production of The Deputy, in which he played the part of Pope Pius XII. And as you may or may not know, Hart premise in The Deputy is that the Pope did much less than he might have done to save the Jews from the Nazis during World War II. And Leo, who was a Catholic, and I used to kid him, how profoundly Catholic he was, used to vary to me from time to time depending on what was going on in his life. But anyway, Leo became very obsessed with this, and I know he went around and had talks with various spiritual advisors about whether he morally should play this part of the Pope. Anyway, he ultimately did, and I'm told by my brother who directed it that he was absolutely brilliant in it. And I, as it turned out, was working with Leo. I came back in 1969 from New York because my father was ill, and while I was back in Canada, Jean Gascon called me up and asked me to go to Stratford they were reviving Molière's Tartuffe from the summer before, when they had done it. And Douglas Rain had played Orgon, the husband, the cuckolded husband, or the would-be cuckold, as it were. And then that year, 69, Douglas was in London, working in London, and couldn't reproduce his role. And Gascon asked me if I would come and do it, and I said, yes, I'd be delighted to. And, so I was suddenly reunited with Leo, who was in the production, and then the following year, I was invited to go back to Stratford to play Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, and to play Judge Brock in Hedda Gabler. And Leo was playing Antonio, who is, of course, the Merchant of Venice in that play. And he was also to play Eilert Lovborg in the Hedda Gabler. So I saw a lot of him that summer, and we renewed our old friendship. And of course, that summer, we finished doing Hedda Gabler, but that was a limited run. And we were still doing The Merchant when Leo very tragically drove himself off Highway 401 coming back from the airport where he was picking up a friend, a Roman Catholic priest, as it turned out, and killed himself, which was really incredibly difficult. And I remember being profoundly moved, and we'd done The Merchant on a Saturday matinee at the Festival Theatre. And I left and went up to my summer cottage up in Muskoka on Saturday evening and for all day Sunday, planning to come back on Monday. And they called me on early Sunday morning to say that Leo had died. And I got back on Monday. I've forgotten. It seems incredibly short. Suddenly we were there on stage to do The Merchant of Venice, and everything was the same. And there was this actor, the silhouette was the same, the costume was the same, and so on. And then you walked out onto the brightly lit stage, and where Leo should have been standing was somebody else. I just get frantic. I wanted to yell, to hell with the show must go on. Can't we just stop for a moment and say, something parlous has happened here, you know. However, that's the way it goes. But I will never forget that. To cope with that trauma. And he was a sweetheart of a man.
Glad I asked. Can you tell me a little bit about the Dominion Drama Festival?
Well, that was a very important part of theatrical life during the 30s and 40s. By the time I remember it, which would be the 40s, I guess, the country was broken up into various geographical sections. I mean, here in Toronto, we were part of what was called the Central Ontario Drama League, CODL. And the whole country was divided up in this way, in areas. And they would have, every year, they would have, break themselves up into subunits and put on amateur plays, usually one-act plays. And then they would all meet and they would have a festival. They would have a competition in which they would invite an adjudicator in. Each, the Central Ontario Drama League had its own festival, CODL festival. Everybody would come and do their plays, and they would be adjudicated, and somebody would be named a winner. And then at the end of the year, in May or June or thereabouts, the winners from the various districts would meet for the Dominion Drama Festival, and that meant that the winner from each section was like the Stanley Cup, you know. I mean, would meet and they would present all the winning plays from the various things, and gradually they would be eliminated down to the winner of the whole kit and caboodle, and that was an event that assumed quite a lot of importance ultimately before it all ended, but so much so that I mean, people, I can't remember what the circumstances were, but finally the Dominion Drama Festival was sponsored, I think it was by Hiram Walker, one of the distilleries anyway, which we thought was a great hoot at the time. But they had sponsors and this kind of thing going on.
Headed by MacDonald.
Oh, yes. Richard MacDonald? I think it's Richard. Yes, he was the sort of one permanent employee. I think he was the only person who got a salary, I think. He was the sort of permanent secretary of the thing, and sent out invitations and did all that kind of thing.
Tom Patterson, what does it mean to you, the name?
Well, you know that. You don't have to ask me that. I mean, come on. We all know that Tom conceived the idea of putting on Shakespeare plays in a town called Stratford, Ontario, which has a tiny little creek, which they call the Avon, which empties into something they call Lake Victoria. But yes, it was Tom's conceit that they do that. And we know that he had the blessing of McCain Hunter, for which he was working at the time. And we know that through Dora Mae Moore, he was given Tony Guthrie's name, and he got in touch with Guthrie. And the genius of it all is that by getting in touch with Guthrie, he got in touch with probably the only person in the professional theatre who would have been insane enough to say, let's try it. And that's what happened. Because, at that point, Tom had very little to offer except some ill-formed goodwill from the mayor of Stratford. But none of them had any concept of what starting a festival would involve. But Tony saw the potential, and he had the the energy and the chutzpah to get it done.
Did the name Laurel Crosby and Robin Patterson mean...
Well, yes, Robin was at that time Tom's wife.
Mm-hmm. She was acting? Was she acting?
Robin?
Yeah.
I don't ever remember Robin acting.
They had to do something, guaranteed a tour. They had to guarantee. What does that mean? To guarantee a tour?
Well, they ultimately were involved in running the Canadian Players Tour. That's where you get that. To guarantee a tour, in my terms, would mean that they had to find money to guarantee the salaries, the actors' salaries. I would assume. But I have no idea what their financial arrangements were. But they did run the Canadian Players for several years.
Did you ever work with any of the leading men like Don Heron, Lloyd Faulkner?
Yes, I worked with both those gentlemen. And,
Little Needles.
Yes, yes.
Anything ring a bell? Any funny stories?
Oh, we're into funny stories. All right. No, there's only one story I would like to tell, but I won't because it's rude, and it's an unkind story, so I won't tell it.
There's a lot of drinking going on in those days. I mean, I know that now you have wine and cheese. Back then, it was hard liquor put out. Was this a unifying force for a lot of people, drinking?
A unifying force? Well, I don't know about that. I guess possibly it had degrees of unification. I suppose that the drinking that went on in the early years of Stratford, I assume that's what you're talking about, didn't seem to me to be excessive at the time. Everybody did it, more or less, did it. Some individuals were a little more enthusiastic than others, but I do remember thinking years later that we used to, do a performance, and then we go out and have a few drinks, perhaps go out to the quarry at St. Mary's and have a midnight dip and come back and go to the Jerusi's for bacon and eggs and go and get to bed and get up in the morning, and nobody had a hangover, nobody had any problems at all that I remember. I mean, at all. I couldn't do it now, but one apparently had stamina and energy and stuff at that time. But I guess probably viewed now with the way things have changed, eyebrows might be raised. You're quite right that it tended to be hard liquor rather than wine that was drunk.
Because there was this famous story about Guinness having to register as an alcoholic in order just to buy his gin in Ontario because of the laws of the time.
Oh, well, yes, but
If I were to ask you, if Canadian audiences were a person, one person, what kind of relationship would you have with?
Don't like that question. I don't know what it means. And
Because we're at the end of the tape, and I'm trying a few
I see.
wild ones.
That's a kind of
You've played Britain. You've played the States.
Dr. Joyce Brothers parlor game you're
You
suggesting.
generalize, yes, I understand. That's a bit much. Okay, the technicalities, the day that you gave over the keys to close down the Crest, can you just quickly summarize?
Well, I wasn't there, so I was in the States. I came back the previous year when the first time the Canada Council refused a grant, and we had to put things in abeyance, and I came up and lent moral support to my brother for a couple of months, or a month anyway. That was the year before they closed. So that would have been 64, the autumn of 64. But then I went back to New York and pursued my career, and they limped through that season, 64, 65, and then finally closed the 65, 66 season the following year. And I wasn't around for the actual denouement. I think my brother was, by the time it got to that point, was heartsick and exhausted, and I'm sure he couldn't wait to get out from under and just go and have a good long lie down somewhere. Must have been very rough for him.
We have to tear down pretty much now. Yeah, I think we've really covered all kinds of stuff. Is there anything I seem to have missed, by the way?
Well, we didn't talk about New York at all.
Yes, that is true. We're trying to focus on the Canadian.
Yes, of course.
How about Canadians in New York, if we can simply ask that? Was there a community of Canadians in New York?
Not as I understand that in Hollywood from time to time there has been a noticeable group of Canadians who socialize and sort of keep in touch with each other. I never found that was true in New York. There were individuals there from time to time while I was there. Chris Plummer lived there in or near New York for some of the years I was there, but I never saw that much of Christopher. Oh, the odd party, something like that. But no, there was not a huge Canadian contingent. The late Drew Thompson used to pop down every now and then. He'd be in residence for a while. More recently, Paul Hecht has been there. But no, I found that most people who came from Canada to New York quickly sort of blended into the New York scenery and became part of that scene rather than establishing a Canadian beachhead.